The police didn't come to arrest my husband. They came for me. And that's when I realized the divorce was his alibi. The conference room at Meridian Holdings smelled like leather and expensive cologne. I sat in the back corner, hands folded in my lap, watching my ex-husband Dashiell charm the room like he always had. 3 months divorced, and he still commanded attention the way a conductor commands an orchestra. Effortlessly, automatically, with the kind of confidence that made people lean in. The quarterly audit review was mandatory for all former board members with remaining financial ties to the company. That's what my lawyer told me when the summons arrived. I almost didn't come. Almost let them believe what everyone else believed, that I was too broken, too humiliated, too small to show my face after what Dashiell had done. But I came anyway. Mrs. Harrow. Apologies, Miss Harrow, the lead auditor, Gerald Pemberton, said my name like it tasted sour. We weren't sure you'd attend. Dashiell glanced back at me, his expression carefully neutral. Sympathetic, even. The wrong party graciously tolerating the presence of his troubled ex-wife. His attorney, a silver-haired woman named Corinne Hastings, whispered something in his ear. He nodded solemnly. I'm still a shareholder, I said quietly. I have a right to be here. Gerald exchanged looks with the CFO. Technically, yes. Though given the circumstances of your separation, we thought perhaps. She's welcome to stay, Dashiell interrupted, magnanimous. Thessaly deserves to understand what's happening with the company, even if she's no longer involved in operations. If you're enjoying this story, please consider liking this post and subscribing. Your support helps me share more stories about people who refuse to stay silent when others tried to silence them. Thank you. The patronizing kindness in his voice made my chest tighten. 3 years married to the man. 3 years of being Dr. Thessaly Harrow, acclaimed forensic accountant, reduced to Dashiell Crane's wife who had some kind of breakdown. That's what people said after the divorce. That I'd become paranoid, erratic, that I'd accused him of things he'd never done, and when he couldn't take it anymore, he'd had no choice but to leave. I said nothing. I'd learned the power of silence. The audit presentation began. Meridian Holdings was a mid-tier investment firm specializing in sustainable infrastructure projects, water systems, renewable energy, waste management. Dashiell had built it from nothing after leaving his family's real estate empire. Noble work. Clean work. The kind of company that attracted idealistic young investors and impressed journalists. Gerald clicked through slides showing quarterly returns, asset allocations, fund performance. Everything looked healthy. Strong, even. Dashiell listened with the focused attention of someone who truly cared about every detail. He asked intelligent questions. He thanked the team for their diligence. I watched him perform. Now, before we conclude, Gerald said, glancing at his notes, we do need to address one irregularity flagged by the external audit team. The room shifted. Dashiell's posture didn't change, but I saw his fingers still against the table. Irregularity? Corinne asked sharply. Nothing serious, Gerald assured her quickly. Just some discrepancies in fund transfers from 2023. Specifically, transactions routed through offshore accounts during Q2 and Q3. The documentation is incomplete. My pulse quickened. 2023, the year we were married. Those accounts were closed years ago, Dashiell said smoothly. Part of the corporate restructuring when we pivoted to domestic-only investments. Everything was documented and approved by the previous compliance officer. Yes, we have that documentation, Gerald agreed. But there's a gap. Several wire transfers, totaling approximately $18 million, that don't appear in the official ledgers. They went out, but there's no record of where they landed or what they funded. Corinne leaned forward. Who authorized those transfers? Gerald hesitated. His eyes flicked to me, then away. According to the digital signatures and access logs, they were authorized by Miss Thessaly Harrow. Then Mrs. Crane. The room went silent. I felt every eye turn toward me. Not with curiosity. With suspicion. That's impossible, I said quietly. I never authorized any offshore transfers. The logs show your employee ID, Gerald said. He didn't sound accusatory. He sounded uncomfortable. Your biometric access. Time-stamped entries during business hours when you were physically in the building. Dashiell ran a hand through his hair, the picture of a man caught in an awful position. Thessaly had full system access during our marriage. She was involved in operations before she. He trailed off delicately. Before things became difficult for her. I was not involved in fund management, I said, keeping my voice level. I consulted on compliance frameworks. I never had authorization to move money. Nevertheless, Corinne said coolly, the logs are clear. And conveniently, this comes to light now, months after your divorce was finalized and you attempted to claim additional assets. There it was, the narrative. The crazy ex-wife, desperate for money, now being exposed as a thief who'd stolen from the company during the marriage. I didn't take anything, I said. Then where did $18 million go, Miss Harrow? Gerald asked. I didn't answer. Because I didn't know. Not yet. But I was beginning to understand. The meeting ended with Gerald promising a full forensic audit and appropriate authorities being notified if necessary. Dashiell shook hands with everyone, projecting weary professionalism. Poor man, their faces said. Divorcing her wasn't enough now this. His mother, Octavia Crane, who sat on Meridian's advisory board, stopped me in the hallway. She'd always been cold to me, but now her expression was pure ice. You'll return what you stole, she said quietly, or my son will press charges. He's been more than generous, letting you walk away with anything at all. I didn't steal anything, Octavia. You were always too ambitious for your own good, Thessaly, marrying into this family, thinking you could take what wasn't yours. She leaned closer. You're out of your depth. Whatever game you think you're playing, it's over. She swept past me, leaving the scent of gardenias and contempt. I stood alone in the hallway, my reflection staring back at me from the polished windows. I looked small, tired, defeated, exactly how I needed to look. This is the part where the story gets complicated, and if you're still with me, drop a comment sharing what you think is really happening here. I love reading your theories, and your engagement helps more people find these stories. Thank you for being here. I didn't go home. I went to my storage unit in South Portland, the one I'd rented 6 months before the divorce, the one nobody knew about. Inside were 4 filing boxes, a laptop, and a portable scanner. Everything I'd quietly copied during the marriage. Everything Dashiell thought he'd erased. I'd been a forensic accountant for 12 years before I met Dashiell. I tracked money through shell corporations for the SEC. I'd untangled Ponzi schemes. I knew how people hid assets, how they moved money, how they covered their tracks. And I knew when I was being set up. It started small. Dashiell asking me to log into the company system to check something while he was traveling. Me using my credentials at his request because I was his wife and I trusted him. Him thanking me casually, then deleting the messages where he'd asked. I didn't think anything of it then. But 6 months before he filed for divorce, I found a discrepancy. A small one. A fund allocation that didn't match the board minutes. I mentioned it to Dashiell over dinner. He smiled and told me I was overworked, that I was seeing patterns that weren't there, that maybe I should take a break from consulting work and focus on myself. When I pressed, he got concerned, really concerned. He scheduled a doctor's appointment for me without asking, told his mother I was struggling with anxiety, suggested to our friends that I might be burning out. And I started to wonder if he was right, if I was losing perspective, until I found the second discrepancy. Then the third. I stopped mentioning them to Dashiell. Instead, I started documenting. Quietly, carefully, every time he asked me to log in. Every transfer that didn't match the official records. Every offshore account that appeared in internal documents but not in regulatory filings. By the time he filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and my deteriorating mental health, I had copies of everything. But I still didn't know what he'd actually done. Not completely. Now, sitting in my storage unit with Gerald's audit report pulled up on my laptop, I finally understood. The $18 million hadn't disappeared. It had been laundered through a series of infrastructure projects that never broke ground. Fake development deals in countries with loose oversight. Money went out to consultants and contractors who didn't exist. Then it came back, cleaned, through legitimate-looking investment returns. Dashiell had been running a massive fraud scheme for years, using Meridian's reputation as cover. Using investor money meant for sustainable development to fund personal real estate acquisitions, luxury purchases, and an offshore portfolio worth over $40 million. And he'd used my credentials to authorize the transfers. The divorce wasn't about our marriage falling apart. It was his escape hatch, his legal firewall. Once we were divorced, he could claim I'd acted alone, that I'd abused my access, that he'd left me when he'd started to suspect something was wrong. The timeline would support it. The logs would support it. My supposed breakdown would support it. He'd planned it perfectly. Almost. I spent 3 days in that storage unit, barely sleeping, cross-referencing documents with publicly available corporate filings, investment prospectuses, and property records. Every thread connected back to Dashiell, but the authorization trail pointed to me. On the 4th day, 2 federal investigators knocked on my apartment door. Special Agent Renata Kolchak and Special Agent Marcus Verne. Financial Crimes Division. They were polite but firm. They had questions about offshore transactions, about my role at Meridian, about my access to company systems. I didn't authorize those transfers, I told them. Your biometrics say otherwise, Agent Kolchak said. Multiple instances, all time-stamped during your marriage. My ex-husband asked me to log in on his behalf. He used my access without my knowledge. That's a serious accusation, Agent Vern said. Do you have any evidence? I did, but I didn't show them. Not yet. I want immunity before I provide anything, I said. Agent Kolchak studied me. Immunity suggests guilt, Ms. Harrow. Immunity suggests self-preservation, I corrected. I'm a forensic accountant. I know how these investigations work. And I know my ex-husband is very good at making himself look innocent. They left with a warning not to leave the state. I watched them drive away, my hands shaking. Dashiell was already 3 steps ahead. If I went to the authorities with my evidence now, it would look like a desperate ex-wife trying to shift blame. I needed leverage. I needed proof that couldn't be dismissed as revenge. And then I remembered something. Something Dashiell had said during the divorce negotiations. Something his attorney had mentioned in passing. Meridian Holdings wasn't entirely his. My grandmother, Celestine Marwick, died 2 years into my marriage to Dashiell. She'd been a venture capitalist back when female VCs were nearly unheard of, brilliant, ruthless, and unimpressed by charm. She'd liked Dashiell well enough, but she'd never trusted him. Men like that, she'd told me once, think the world is a stage. They perform, and they're dangerous when the audience stops clapping. In her will, she left me a controlling stake in Marwick Capital Trust, a private investment vehicle with holdings in over 30 companies, including a 23% equity position in Meridian Holdings, acquired years before I ever met Dashiell, back when the company was nothing but a proposal and a pitch deck. Dashiell had hated that his company's early funding came from my family money. He tried to buy out the position multiple times, but the trust was ironclad. My grandmother had structured it, so the shares couldn't be sold without my explicit approval. And if I died or became incapacitated, control passed to an independent board of trustees who had a fiduciary duty to maximize value, which meant they'd never sell at a discount and they'd never sell to Dashiell. He was trapped. 23% of his company would always be mine, unless he destroyed my credibility so completely that the trustees removed me for cause, which was exactly what he was trying to do. The emergency shareholder meeting was scheduled for 3 weeks after the investigators contacted me. Meridian's board had voted to suspend all fund operations pending the federal audit. Investors were panicking. Stock was plummeting. And Corinne Hastings had filed a motion to remove me as trustee of the Marwick shares on grounds of criminal conduct and breach of fiduciary duty. If she succeeded, Dashiell could finally buy out my position at a distressed price. He'd own the company outright. And without my shares as leverage, I'd have no power to demand transparency or independent investigation. He'd win. Completely. The meeting was held at the Marwick Center, an office complex my grandmother had developed in downtown Portland. The irony wasn't lost on me. We were fighting over my grandmother's investment in a building she'd built. I arrived early. The conference hall was massive, designed for corporate presentations and high-stakes negotiations. Rows of chairs faced a raised platform with a long table for board members. Behind them, a screen for presentations. Dashiell was already there, conferring quietly with Corinne and 2 other attorneys. He saw me, and his expression softened into something like regret. Poor Thessaly, it said. Why are you doing this to yourself? Gerald Pemberton sat with the audit team. Several major investors occupied the front rows. Octavia Crane sat beside Dashiell, her face carved from marble. And then there was Judge Miriam Holbrook, the independent arbitrator brought in to oversee the trustee removal proceeding. She was in her 70s, sharp-eyed, and famously impatient with theatrics. I took my seat in the second row. Alone. No attorney. No support. That had been deliberate. The meeting began with Gerald presenting the audit findings. $18 million in unauthorized transfers. My credentials. My access. The timing coinciding with my marriage. He presented it clinically without editorializing, but the implications were obvious. Ms. Harrow, Judge Holbrook said, "You've been given multiple opportunities to explain these transactions. Do you have a statement?" I stood. I didn't authorize those transfers. My ex-husband used my access without my knowledge as part of a larger fraud scheme. I have documentation to prove it. Murmurs rippled through the room. Corinne stood smoothly. "Your Honor, Miss Harrow has made these baseless accusations repeatedly since the divorce." She's provided no credible evidence. This is a transparent attempt to deflect blame. I have evidence, I said quietly, but I'll only present it under specific conditions. Judge Holbrook frowned. This isn't a negotiation, Miss Harrow. Actually, it is. I looked directly at Dashiell, because Meridian Holdings isn't the only company involved. The room went silent. Dashiell's expression didn't change, but I saw his jaw tighten. What are you talking about? Gerald asked. I pulled a folder from my bag and approached the platform. Your audit focused on offshore transfers from 2023, but the fraud goes back further. To 2021, before my marriage, when Meridian received its Series B funding from Cascade Ventures. I laid the folder in front of Judge Holbrook. Cascade Ventures is a subsidiary of Crane Family Investments, which is controlled by Dashiell's family trust. The funding was structured as an arm's-length transaction, but it violated SEC regulations on self-dealing because Dashiell failed to disclose his family's ownership stake. Octavia Crane stood. That's absurd. The transaction was reviewed by attorneys who didn't have complete information, I continued, because the ownership structure was hidden behind 3 shell companies registered in Delaware and Wyoming. Companies that I traced using property records, corporate filings, and tax documents. If you're still following this story, thank you. It means the world to me when readers stick with these complicated narratives. If you've enjoyed this so far, please subscribe. I share a new story every week, and your support makes this possible. I turned to face the room. Dashiell didn't just commit fraud. He committed securities fraud. He illegally funneled his family's money into his own company, inflated its valuation, then used that inflated valuation to attract outside investors. The offshore transfers I supposedly authorized, they were payouts to his shell companies. He was stealing investor money to repay his family's secret investment, cleaning fraud with fraud. Dashiell stood slowly. This is fantasy. Thessaly's having another episode. I have the corporate records, I said. I have the wire transfers. I have internal emails from your personal account discussing the scheme. And I have testimony from 3 former employees who'll confirm you routinely asked your wife to log in to company systems on your behalf. His face went pale. You used my credentials because you needed a fall guy, I continued. Someone whose access looked legitimate but who could be discredited when the authorities came looking. You spent a year setting me up, making me seem unstable, erratic, paranoid. You filed for divorce the week before the audit was scheduled because you knew the questions were coming. Corinne stepped forward. Your Honor, this isn't outrageous. I'm not finished. I kept my eyes on Dashiell. You thought divorcing me would protect you, that you could claim I acted alone, that you'd left me when you suspected something was wrong. The timeline would support it. My breakdown would support it. And without my shares in Meridian, I'd have no standing to demand transparency. I pulled out another document. But you made one mistake. Judge Holbrook leaned forward. What mistake? He forgot that the Marwick Capital Trust isn't just an investor. Under the terms of my grandmother's structure, any Marwick holding that exceeds 20% equity grants the trust inspection rights. I placed the document on the table. That means I have legal authority to audit Meridian's books independently. Not as a wife, not as an ex-wife, as a trustee with fiduciary responsibilities to my beneficiaries. The room erupted. That's, Corinne started. Enforceable, I said. I invoked those rights 4 months ago, before the federal audit began. Everything I just described? I found it through a legal, authorized review. A review that Dashiell's attorneys tried to block, which is why they're pushing to remove me as trustee. Because as long as I hold these shares, I can expose everything. Dashiell sat down heavily. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked small. Judge Holbrook studied the documents I'd provided. Gerald was already on his phone, presumably calling the SEC. Investors were shouting questions. Octavia Crane looked like she'd been struck. Your Honor, I said quietly, I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for what my grandmother built this trust to do. Protect against exactly this kind of manipulation. Dashiell Crane didn't just commit fraud. He tried to destroy me to hide it. He used our marriage, the divorce, and my own credentials as weapons. I turned back to Dashiell one last time. The divorce was your firewall. But firewalls work both ways. You separated yourself from me legally, thinking it would protect you. Instead, it preserved the evidence. Because once we divorced, I was no longer your wife. I was a trustee with independent legal authority. And that authority gave me the right to investigate what you'd done. His hands were shaking. The quieter I stayed, I said, the more rope you used. The aftermath moved quickly. Federal investigators seized Meridian's records within 48 hours. The SEC opened a formal investigation into Crane family investments. Dashiell's assets were frozen pending criminal charges. Corinne Hastings withdrew from representation when it became clear her client had lied to her. The investors filed a class action lawsuit. Octavia Crane resigned from the advisory board. The media picked up the story, Tech Darling's fraud scheme exposed by ex-wife he tried to frame. I testified twice. Once for the SEC, once for the FBI. I provided everything: documents, emails, timelines, witness statements. I explained how Dashiell had manipulated my access, how he'd manufactured my breakdown, how he'd orchestrated the divorce to create legal distance. The prosecutors called it one of the most premeditated fraud cases they'd seen. Not because of the financial crime itself, but because of the cruelty of the cover-up. Dashiell took a plea deal. 12 years, asset forfeiture, permanent ban from serving as an officer or director of any public company. I never spoke to him again. 3 months after his sentencing, I stood in my grandmother's office at the Marwick Center. It had been empty since her death, preserved exactly as she'd left it. Mahogany desk, floor-to-ceiling law books, a photograph of her shaking hands with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I'd always thought this office was too big for me. Too grand. Too much. But standing there, looking out over the city, I finally understood what she'd been trying to teach me. Power isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't perform. Real power is structural. It's legal authority quietly held. It's rights exercised at precisely the right moment. It's the patience to let someone destroy themselves while you document every step. Dashiell had spent years underestimating me, treating me like an accessory to his ambition, a credential to borrow, a reputation to exploit, a person to discard when convenient. He thought the divorce made him untouchable. He was wrong. The divorce made him visible. It removed the cover of marriage, the shared identity, the presumption of partnership. It isolated him legally, financially, structurally. And in that isolation, every action he'd taken stood out in sharp relief. He'd drawn the outline of his own guilt. I restructured Meridian under new management, used the recovered assets to make investors whole, turned my grandmother's trust into a foundation that supports women in finance and forensic accounting. And I kept the office, because some rooms aren't too big. They're just waiting for the right person to fill them. Thank you so much for reading this story all the way through. If it resonated with you, if you know someone who's been underestimated, framed, or dismissed, please share this with them. Stories like this matter because they remind us that silence isn't weakness and patience isn't surrender. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is simply waiting for the right moment to speak. If you'd like to read more stories about justice, revenge, and people who refuse to stay down, please subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.